We hear about climate change a lot in the news, but more often than not, when we hear about climate change, the topic is the effects on the planet or the effects on people. It isn't that often that we talk about the effects of climate change on animals. Here with me today is Pam Tate, and she's the vice chair of the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project and a member of the Leadership Council of the African Wildlife Foundation. And she'll talk to us today about climate change. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Okay, so to begin with, what exactly is the climate reality? And then how did you get involved with that and the African Wildlife Foundation?
Well, first, climate reality. I had been the CEO of an educational nonprofit for 30 years, but was always concerned about climate change, way back to when I saw Al Gore's first documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. And so when I left my full-time role in 2019, I knew that I was going to dedicate my time to both climate change and biodiversity. So I went to one of Al Gore's trainings, and he started the Climate Reality Project in 2006, basically to train a leadership corps of people who would go out and talk about, just educate the public about climate change. Because in the beginning, that's what everybody thought was needed, just to show people what was happening, what the data is. And so I went to his training in the summer of 2019, and I joined the Chicago chapter of Climate Reality not long after that. We spent all of our time making presentations. I don't know how many I made, churches, community groups, chambers of commerce, everyone. So then the African Wildlife Foundation is kind of a separate strand for me. I had always cared about giraffes my whole life. I don't know how I got interested in them, but as a child even. And so I was interested in African wildlife. And became a donor to the African Wildlife Foundation. Eventually, I got to know the staff and I was asked to join the Leadership Council. And then I realized, after I was really a part of both groups, how interrelated the biodiversity issue is with climate change, and how climate change is either directly or indirectly affecting wildlife around the world, but especially I was noting in Africa. So these two things kind of came together for me.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so then given your interest in giraffe and the African Wildlife Foundation and the climate change, one of the species that giraffe like feeding on are acacia trees. And probably, I would guess, like everything else, the climate does influence the distribution of acacia trees and has an impact on giraffe. How is climate change working through acacia trees to get to giraffe?
I guess I would say, and this is mainly from the African Wildlife Foundation's information, that acacia trees are definitely affected by drought. That change in things becoming drier in certain parts of Africa and wetter in other parts has really affected where giraffes go, where they seek food. And for example, in East Africa, there are increasing amounts of precipitation, and even though there may be more vegetation, they are not doing as well in wetter climates. So it has made me wonder, how do we put together the thriving of the acacia tree in certain parts of the continent and put that together with where giraffes do better, because they seem to do better in hotter, drier climates. I think that's going to be a part of what has to be paid attention to if we want to think about the survival of both the trees and the giraffe.
Part of this biodiversity being connected together. Now, on the IUCN Red List, the giraffe are listed as threatened with extinction. And then among the major threats to extinction, there's civil unrest and poaching and sort of ecological changes. If you were on the IUCN Red List, would you list climate change as a major factor influencing them? Or are those other factors kind of subsumed under climate change? Or
Well,
how would you handle it?
I think what I would say is that climate change is is a threat to some of the threats that you have just identified. Meaning that, for example, as Africans have more difficulty with agricultural production due to either heavy precipitation or too much drought, because that's one of the things that climate change does is everything's more intense. Whether it's dry, it gets much drier. If it's wet, it can get much wetter. So a lot of the things that people dependent on for agricultural reliability are being affected by climate change. And then that in turn affects them turning to giraffe for, say, protein in their diets if they can't get it from their agricultural production. So that's a way in which climate change affects people, then people change their behavior, and that affects giraffe. And I think that kind of a chain reaction isn't really talked about as much. Um, the I do think that the habitat loss is definitely related to climate change and agricultural expansion. But a lot of giraffe have lost habitat because the conditions under which they were living are no longer viable. So they are forced to move and to change their territory. And then that runs into human populations in areas where they didn't run into them before. So climate change is causing habitat loss along with development, and then giraffe populations struggle and suffer because they now have lost area as well. So I think that's the kind of relationship climate change has to those threats.
Okay, so I think some people confuse climate change with global warming, but from what you're saying, in effect, climate change is causing intense droughts at the same time as it's causing massive flooding just in different areas. That's influenced what people do. It's also influencing what giraffe are doing, but that would also influence what the other animals are doing in Africa. So this gets back to your original interest in biodiversity. Isn't this sort of um, a problem that all wildlife in Africa face? Oh, as well as the plants. Acacia trees got to figure this out too.
Yes, yes, absolutely. A lot of people think in fairly black and white terms about global warming. No, if it's getting warmer, then it's getting warmer everywhere on the planet, and that's our problem. But actually, what is going on is that it's getting more intense, hotter, yes, definitely hotter. This is 2024 was the hottest year on record on Earth overall. So there is a general warming trend, but in specific locations, what is experienced is not necessarily just in continued warming. What is experienced is intensity and frequency of whatever phenomenon it is, whether it's rain and flooding, or it's drought, um, or it's sea level rise in another area. So I think when we think about global warming, we have to think about the differential effect it has on different climates in the continent, and then what the animal's reaction and plants' reaction is to it varies. So that I think that's one of the reasons, in fact, why it's harder to have the public understand the impact of climate change, because it's felt differently in Maine than it is in Arizona. And Fred, Africa is one of the first continents that are feeling the effect to the extent that certain sections are uninhabitable.
So obviously you can't predict the future, but of course have to ask the question, do you think that things are moving in the right direction at the moment? Or do you think it's a major in the wrong direction, or um,
I
how do you
think
see the future?
I think it depends on the country and its leadership. And it changes depending on who's in a position to make decisions. And if you look at Northern Europe, for example, they're definitely on the right path. If you look at, the Scandinavian countries, for example, there aren't even, I think probably 5% of the purchases of cars now are gas purchases and the rest are electric. They have made a shift through national policy and local policy, and they are definitely moving in the right direction. And a number of other European countries are as well. Here, we were just starting to turn in the right direction when this administration was elected. And since they don't really acknowledge that climate change is real, and they are very supportive of the fossil fuel industry, I think things are going absolutely in the wrong direction here. But fortunately, we're a big country, but we're not the only country. And so, things are changing in China and in other countries that are Australia, some countries in South America, but then there are countries where their leaders are like ours, who really don't believe it or don't care. Huh?
Africa has I said Africa has lots of different countries. So, I mean, it's a
Exactly.
huge mix of countries.
Exactly.
Do they have a climate reality chapter any place in Africa?
Yeah, I don't know which countries have them, but they do have them in every country in the world now, I believe. And and these are all volunteers, who get training and then start to really realize that they have to take action, and so they go back to their home country and start whatever they can start. And I haven't yet, this is kind of on my list, but I haven't yet connected with the chapters in Africa. But I would like to, because I'd like to know what relationship they have to wildlife conservation. Some people in the climate change movement, and this may not be relevant to our immediate podcast, but some people think that the only thing to work on is reducing emissions. Like it all comes down to reducing emissions, decarbonize buildings, electrify transportation, etc. But I'm on the end of it, that where I feel that it's about also nature-based solutions and biodiversity issues, that we have to worry about that just as much as we worry about what's happening to the human population. And so I'm interested in what we're doing with agriculture, forests, wetlands, phytoplankton, all of the ways that we might be able to enrich the earth instead of destroying it. And therefore the wildlife on the earth becomes central in that view of things. And so what I don't know is whether the climate reality chapters in Africa have that, what I think of as a more of a connected or holistic view, or not.
So it seems like it's still uncertain, but at least people in Africa are beginning to um, become activists.
They are. Some of them have to start out. I met some of them at some of the international meetings, and some of them have said that they're still in the educational stage. They're still
Oh, okay.
working to have their fellow villagers just understand what's happening in the world, because what people there tend to say is, but we're not causing it. So how do we fit in? And even if they're not causing it, they can introduce nature-based solutions. One, for example, would be regenerative agriculture, where they cover the ground, conserve the soil, keep the carbon in the ground, diversify their crop base, um, and have cover crops in the off seasons, and don't use fertilizers and pesticides that destroy the water and the water sources for wildlife. that would be an example of a practice that could be introduced at not a high cost, really, and then could not only sequester more carbon, but create better conditions for animals and plants.
Okay, so even if people aren't directly working with giraffe, then doing something to ameliorate climate change in
Yes,
Africa, that's around the globe, in effect, could help save giraffe for future generations by reducing the impacts of the flooding and the droughts and
yes,
everything else, and not just giraffe, but the other animals. So
yes.
really the key is the global efforts to
Hmm.
do something about the climate change, right?
Yeah, that's well said. You're very clear. I wish I'd said it that way.
Well, you have been saying it that way. I'm just like the bullet point parts. But
Yeah,
thank you very much for all the information. And we'll look forward to speaking again in 10 years and saying how wonderful it's been because a lot of the stuff's been solved.
I hope so. I'd like to be a part of solving it.
Okay, and thanks to the listeners for staying tuned in.